If survival had a sound, it would be the rain hitting the pavement the night Emily Carter lost everything. She stood barefoot on the cold concrete outside her apartment building, the neon exit sign flickering above her like a cruel joke, her 5-year-old daughter Lily pressed against her chest, trembling not from the cold but from confusion she was too young to understand, and Emily forced a smile she didn't feel, brushing damp strands of blonde hair from Lily's face as if that small gesture could hold their world together for just a few more seconds, but the door behind them had already slammed shut and locked, and there was no going back. 24 hours earlier, Emily had been standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of a roadside diner just off I-95, balancing 3 plates on one arm while refilling coffee for truckers who barely looked up, her feet aching after a 16-hour stretch, her uniform smelling faintly of grease and cheap detergent, and still she moved fast, because speed meant tips and tips meant rent. And rent meant Lily got a bed instead of a couch. She hadn't noticed the black car pulling in at first, hadn't heard the shift in the room until voices lowered without anyone saying a word, until even the clatter of forks against plates softened like the air itself was holding its breath, and when she finally looked up, he was already inside, walking in like the place belonged to him without ever needing to say it, tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that didn't wrinkle under pressure. His presence quiet but absolute, the kind of man who didn't ask for space. He was given it. Sebastian Hale. Emily didn't know his name yet, only the way her hands suddenly felt less steady, the way her heartbeat shifted as she approached his table, forcing her voice into something polite, something normal. Coffee, she asked, but the word came out softer than she intended, and when her fingers brushed the rim of the glass, it slipped, a sharp crack echoing across the diner as it shattered against the tile, and for a moment, everything froze. The manager inhaled sharply, someone cursed under their breath, and Emily felt that familiar drop in her stomach, the one that always came right before consequences she couldn't afford. I'm so sorry, she rushed out, already kneeling, already reaching for pieces she shouldn't touch, but then she stopped, because he hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even looked annoyed. He just watched her, not like a customer judging a mistake, but like someone reading something deeper beneath it, his gaze steady, almost unsettling in its calm, and when she finally dared to look up, their eyes met for less than a second, but it felt longer, like something silent had just passed between them, something she didn't understand. He left minutes later, without another word, but on the table, beneath a tip larger than she'd made all week, was a simple black card with a number written in clean, deliberate ink. Now, back in the rain, Emily stared at that same card in her shaking hand, the ink slightly smudged from the water, Lily's small voice breaking through the sound of the storm. Mommy, where are we going? And Emily swallowed hard, because for the first time, she didn't have an answer, only a number, and a feeling she couldn't explain, and as the wind picked up around them, she pressed the card tighter between her fingers, her thumb hovering over her phone screen, knowing one thing with absolute certainty: if she made this call, nothing about her life would ever be the same. The call connected before Emily could change her mind, and for a second she said nothing, only the sound of rain filling the silence between them until his voice came through, calm and steady, as if he had been expecting this exact moment. Are you somewhere safe? And the question caught her off guard because no one had asked her that in a long time, not like it mattered, not like the answer could change anything. And she looked down at Lily curled against her, small fingers clutching the fabric of her jacket, and Emily forced her voice to stay even. Not exactly, she said, the words barely above a whisper, but he did not ask her to explain, did not rush her, did not fill the space with empty comfort. He simply responded, stay where you are, like it was not a suggestion, like it was a decision already made, and before she could protest, before she could ask what that meant, the line went quiet. 10 minutes passed, or maybe it was 5, Emily could not tell because time felt different when you had nowhere to go, when every passing car sounded like a possibility that never stopped, when every drop of rain felt heavier than the last, and she shifted her weight to keep Lily warm, whispering soft reassurances she did not fully believe, until headlights appeared at the far end of the street, cutting through the storm with a slow, deliberate approach, not hurried, not uncertain, just inevitable. The black car stopped a few feet away, and for a moment nothing happened, the engine idling low, steady, controlled, and Emily felt her pulse quicken, every instinct telling her this was the moment that would divide her life into before and after. And then the back door opened, not by the driver, but from the inside, like an invitation already decided, and she hesitated, just for a second, long enough to feel the weight of every choice she had ever made pressing against her chest, long enough to wonder if this was a mistake she could not undo, but Lily stirred in her arms, murmuring softly. And that was enough, because survival was no longer about fear, it was about moving forward even when you did not understand the path. She stepped closer, the warmth from the car brushing against her skin, and when she leaned in, she saw him sitting there, exactly as he had been in the diner, composed, untouched by the chaos of the outside world, his gaze lifting to meet hers, not surprised, not questioning, just certain. And for the first time that night, Emily felt something shift, not safety. Not yet, but something close to it, something unfamiliar that made her chest tighten in a different way. "Get in," he said quietly, and there was no force in his voice, no pressure, just a calm certainty that made it feel like the only option left in a world that had taken all others away, and Emily swallowed, adjusting Lily gently against her shoulder before stepping inside, the door closing behind them with a soft, final sound that seemed to separate the storm from whatever came next. And as the car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the only life she had known, Emily realized she had just crossed a line she could never go back from, and across from her, Sebastian Hale watched in silence, as if he already understood that everything about her world had just changed. The car moved smoothly through the rain, the world outside blurring into streaks of light and shadow, and Emily sat stiffly in the back seat with Lily still asleep against her chest, every muscle in her body tense as if she could still run even though she knew she would not anymore, and across from her Sebastian Hale said nothing at first, his presence filling the space without effort, the kind of silence that was not empty but deliberate, controlled, and Emily became aware of every small detail, the soft leather beneath her fingers, the quiet hum of the engine, the way the driver never once looked back, as if everything had already been decided long before she stepped inside. She adjusted Lily carefully, brushing a hand over her daughter's damp hair, and for a moment she forgot where she was, focusing only on the steady rhythm of Lily's breathing, the only thing that made sense in a night that had taken everything else from her, until his voice broke the silence, low and even. "How old is she?" And the question was simple, almost ordinary, but it carried something she could not quite name, and Emily hesitated before answering. "5, her voice soft but steady, and he nodded once, his gaze shifting briefly to Lily before returning to Emily, not intrusive, not distant, just observant in a way that made her feel seen and exposed at the same time. "You work 2 jobs, he said after a moment. Not a question, and Emily's breath caught slightly because there was no reason. He should know that, not from a single night in a diner, not from a few seconds of interaction, and she frowned, a flicker of unease crossing her expression. "How do you know that?" she asked, and for the first time, something almost like a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, not warm, not cold, just knowing. "I notice things," he replied, as if that explained everything, as if it was enough. The car turned onto a quieter street, lined with tall trees and houses that looked untouched by the kind of life Emily knew, and she felt the shift immediately, the distance from everything familiar growing with each passing second, and her grip tightened slightly around Lily, instinctively protective, even though she could not define what she was protecting her from, because nothing about this felt dangerous in the way she understood danger, and that was what unsettled her the most. "You did not have to call," Sebastian said after a pause, his tone unchanged, "but you did," and Emily looked up at him, something defensive rising in her chest. "I did not have a choice," she replied quietly, and his gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary, not challenging, not dismissing, just studying. And then he shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. "There is always a choice," he said, "you just decided which one you could live with," and the words lingered in the air between them, heavier than they should have been, because part of her knew he was right, even if she did not want to admit it. The car slowed as iron gates appeared ahead, tall and silent, opening without hesitation as if the vehicle had been expected, and Emily felt her heartbeat shift again, not faster, but deeper, like something inside her was trying to catch up with a reality that was already moving forward without her permission. And as they passed through, she realized she had stepped into a world she did not understand, one that operated on rules she had never been taught, and across from her, Sebastian Hale watched her quietly, as if he already knew that this was the moment she would start to realize that survival was no longer the only thing at stake. The car came to a slow, silent stop beneath a wide stone overhang, the kind that shielded everything beneath it from the storm outside, and for a moment Emily did not move, her hand still resting protectively on Lily's back as if stepping out would somehow break the fragile sense of control she was holding onto, but the door beside her opened smoothly and a man in a dark suit stood waiting, not speaking, not rushing, simply present in a way that made it clear hesitation would not change what came next, and Emily stepped out carefully, the warmth of the car replaced by a different kind of stillness, one that felt controlled rather than cold. The house in front of her rose higher than anything she had ever lived near, its windows glowing softly against the night, not flashy, not loud, just quietly powerful, and she swallowed as she adjusted Lily in her arms, suddenly aware of the contrast between her worn shoes and the polished stone beneath her feet, between the life she had known and the one she had just stepped into. Inside, the air was warm, carrying a faint scent of wood and something clean, expensive without trying to be, and Emily paused just past the threshold, unsure where to go, unsure what was expected of her, until Sebastian walked past her with the same calm certainty he carried everywhere, removing his jacket as if this place obeyed him without question, and he glanced back briefly. "You can put her down," he said, his voice quieter now, almost softer, and Emily hesitated again, instinct tightening in her chest, but something in his tone told her this was not a demand, not a command, just an option she could take or refuse, and after a second, she nodded slightly, following the direction of a woman who had appeared silently from a nearby hallway, older, composed, her expression kind but observant, as if she had seen many nights like this before. The room she was led into was simple compared to the rest of the house, but to Emily it felt like something out of a different life, a clean bed, soft blankets, a lamp casting a gentle glow instead of harsh light, and she carefully laid Lily down, brushing her hair back once more, watching for a second longer than necessary just to be sure she was still safe, still real, before stepping back. When she turned, Sebastian was already there, leaning slightly against the doorframe, not intruding, not distant, just present in a way that made it impossible to ignore him, and Emily straightened instinctively, crossing her arms as if that could create some kind of boundary between them. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question finally breaking through everything else, and he did not answer immediately, his gaze steady, measuring, as if deciding how much truth to give her. And then he stepped forward just enough for the light to catch his expression clearly. "Because you needed help," he said simply, and Emily frowned, something in her resisting that answer, because it felt too easy, too clean for a world that had never given her anything without a cost. "People do not do things like this for no reason," she replied, her voice quieter now but no less certain. And for a moment, something shifted in his eyes, not annoyance, not impatience, but recognition, as if he understood exactly why she could not accept something without expecting the weight behind it, and he nodded once, slowly. "You are right," he said, "they usually do not," and the pause that followed felt intentional, deliberate, like a space he was giving her to think, to question, to stay or leave even when leaving was no longer an option, and then he added, just as quietly, "But that does not mean this comes with a price you cannot afford," and Emily held his gaze, searching for something hidden beneath the words, something she could use to understand what this really was, but all she found was the same calm certainty that had followed him from the diner to this place, and for the first time, she realized that whatever this was, it was not something she could measure the way she had measured everything else in her life, and that uncertainty settled deep in her chest as she stood there, knowing that stepping inside had not just given her shelter, it had pulled her into something far more complicated than survival alone. Sleep did not come easily, not even in a room that felt warmer than anything Emily had known in months, and she sat at the edge of the bed watching Lily breathe, counting each rise and fall like it was the only thing keeping her grounded, the silence around her too perfect, too controlled, nothing creaking, nothing distant, no shouting through thin walls, no footsteps from strangers on the other side of a cheap apartment door. And that absence of noise felt louder than anything she was used to. Like her body did not know how to exist without tension, she reached out and adjusted the blanket around Lily again, even though it did not need adjusting, her fingers lingering just long enough to remind herself that this was real, that her daughter was safe, at least for now, and that word echoed in her mind in a way she could not ignore, because safety had always been temporary, always conditional, always something that could disappear without warning, just like everything else. A soft knock came at the door, so light it almost blended into the silence, and Emily's shoulders tensed immediately, her body reacting before her thoughts could catch up, but the door opened slowly and the same woman from earlier stepped inside, carrying a folded set of clothes and a small tray, her movements calm, practiced. "You should eat something," she said gently, placing the tray on the nearby table, her voice carrying a warmth that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome, and Emily hesitated before standing, glancing once more at Lily before stepping away, as if even a few feet of distance required permission she was not ready to give. "Thank you, Emily," said quietly, her voice rough from everything she had held back, and the woman nodded, studying her for a brief second, not judging, not prying, just observing in a way that felt oddly similar to him. "You are safe here," she added softly, as if she knew exactly what Emily needed to hear, and for a moment, Emily almost believed her, almost let herself relax into the idea, but experience held her back, keeping her grounded in a reality where nothing came without consequence. "What is your name?" Emily asked, needing something tangible, something normal to hold on to, and the woman gave a small, reassuring smile. "Maria," she replied, and there was something steady in the way she said it, like it carried history, like she had been here long enough to understand how this world worked, and Emily nodded, filing that away, even though she did not know why it mattered. After Maria left, closing the door quietly behind her, Emily sat down again, staring at the untouched food for a moment, before finally reaching for it, her hands slower now, more deliberate, as if she was trying to prove to herself that she could still make simple decisions in a place where everything else felt out of her control. And as she took a bite, she realized how long it had been since she had eaten without rushing, without calculating time, without thinking about what came next. Somewhere deeper in the house, a door closed softly, followed by the faint echo of footsteps, and Emily's attention shifted. Immediately, her instincts still sharp, still searching for patterns, for meaning, and she found herself wondering where he was, what he was doing, why he had chosen to bring her here instead of anywhere else, because nothing about this felt random, nothing about him felt accidental, and that thought settled into her chest in a way that made her uneasy, because it meant this night had not just happened to her, it had been seen, understood, maybe even anticipated. She looked down at Lily again, brushing her fingers lightly across her daughter's cheek, and for the first time since stepping into this house, a different kind of thought formed in her mind, quieter but stronger, not about what she had lost, but about what this could become. And that possibility felt just as dangerous as anything she had left behind, because hope, in her experience, had always been the most fragile thing of all. Morning arrived too quietly, and that was the first thing Emily noticed when her eyes opened, not the soft light filtering through tall curtains, not the unfamiliar ceiling above her, but the absence of urgency, no alarm, no rushing footsteps, no weight pressing down on her chest demanding she move before she was ready. And for a few seconds she lay completely still, disoriented by a calm she did not trust, until she turned her head and saw Lily still asleep beside her, curled into the blankets. With a peacefulness that felt almost foreign, and something in Emily's chest loosened just slightly, enough for her to breathe a little deeper than she had the night before, she sat up slowly, careful not to wake her, her body still sore from exhaustion that had not fully faded, and she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet meeting the soft rug beneath her, another small detail that reminded her this was not her world, not the one she had fought to survive in, but something else entirely, something she had stepped into without understanding the cost. The clothes Maria had left were neatly folded on the chair nearby, simple but clean, and Emily hesitated before reaching for them, her fingers brushing the fabric as if expecting it to disappear, as if this was still temporary, still something that could be taken away. And she changed quietly, moving with a kind of caution that came from years of living in spaces that were never truly hers. When she opened the bedroom door, the hallway beyond stretched wide and silent, sunlight catching on polished surfaces that reflected more than just light, reflecting a life she had only ever seen from the outside, and she stepped forward slowly, each step deliberate, her senses sharp, absorbing everything, the faint sound of voices somewhere in the distance, the subtle scent of coffee drifting through the air, the quiet efficiency of a place that functioned without chaos. She followed the sound until it led her to a large open room where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a landscape she could not fully see from this angle, and near the far side, Sebastian stood with his back partially turned, speaking to another man in a low voice that carried authority. Without effort, the conversation stopping the moment Emily stepped into view, not abruptly, not suspiciously, just cleanly, as if her presence had already been accounted for, the other man nodded once and stepped away without a word, leaving the space between Emily and Sebastian clear, and for a moment she stayed where she was, uncertain whether to approach or retreat, but his gaze found hers quickly, steady and unreadable, and he gestured slightly toward the table set nearby. "You should eat," he said, the same calm tone as before, as if this was a continuation of something already in motion rather than a new beginning, and Emily hesitated before moving closer, her steps slow but intentional, her eyes scanning the room once more before settling on him again. "My daughter is still asleep," she said quietly, as if that information mattered, as if it needed to be acknowledged, and he nodded once. "She will be looked after," he replied, not dismissive, not overbearing, just certain in a way that left no room for doubt, and Emily studied him for a second longer, searching for something that would explain this, something that would make it fit into the logic she understood, but again, there was only that same quiet control, that same sense that everything here operated on rules she had not learned yet. She sat down slowly, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just enough to feel intentional, and then she looked up at him, the question she had been holding back finally surfacing again, sharper this time, more direct. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steady even though her thoughts were not, and Sebastian did not answer immediately, his gaze holding hers as if weighing something unseen, and then he stepped closer, just enough for the distance between them to feel smaller without becoming threatening. "That depends," he said quietly, "on whether you are here to rest, or to start over," and the words settled between them with a weight that felt different from everything else he had said, not a promise, not a warning, but something in between, something that required her to decide what kind of future she was willing to step into, and Emily felt that shift again, deeper this time, because for the first time in a long time, survival was not the only option in front of her, and that realization was as unsettling as it was impossible to ignore. Emily did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough for her to feel the weight of the choice he had just placed in front of her, because rest sounded temporary and start over sounded permanent, and she had learned the hard way that permanent things came with consequences she could not always control, so she lowered her gaze for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the table as if grounding herself in something solid before she looked back up at him. "I do not even know what starting over means here," she said quietly, her voice steady but honest, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted just slightly, not softer, not harder, just more focused, as if this was the answer he had expected. He moved around the table slowly, not closing the distance completely, just enough to change the angle between them, and when he spoke again, his tone remained calm, measured. "It means you do not go back to what forced you into that storm last night," he said, and Emily felt something tighten in her chest at the simplicity of that statement, because it made everything she had endured sound smaller than it was, easier than it had ever felt, and she shook her head once, a faint, almost reflexive reaction. "It is not that simple," she replied, and this time there was a hint of frustration beneath her words, not directed at him, but at the situation itself, at the idea that her life could be reduced to a decision she was not sure she was ready to make. Sebastian watched her without interrupting, letting her push back, letting her hold on to that resistance, and after a moment he nodded once, acknowledging it without arguing. "No," he said, "it is not simple," and the agreement caught her off guard more than disagreement would have, because she had expected him to insist, to control the direction of the conversation the way he seemed to control everything else, but instead he stepped back slightly, giving her space that felt intentional. "But it is still a choice," he added, and the words landed differently this time, less like pressure and more like a fact she could not avoid. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just a fraction as she looked away from him, her eyes drifting toward the window where the morning light had fully settled over the grounds outside, everything calm, everything untouched, a stark contrast to the life she had known just a day ago, and she realized that this place did not feel temporary in the way she had expected. It felt established, stable, like something that did not bend easily, and that realization made her uneasy in a different way, because it meant if she stayed, she would not just be passing through, she would be stepping into something that could reshape everything she knew. And if I choose to leave, she asked after a moment, her voice quieter now, not challenging, just searching for the boundary, for the line that would tell her how much control she actually had, and Sebastian did not hesitate this time. Then you leave, he said, the answer immediate, straightforward, but there was something beneath it, something unspoken that made her hold his gaze a second longer, as if trying to understand what was not being said, and he continued, his tone unchanged, and you go back to surviving the way you were, and there was no judgment in his voice, no criticism, just a statement that reflected reality as he saw it, and Emily felt that familiar tension return, because she knew he was not wrong. Even if she did not want to admit it out loud, footsteps approached from the hallway. Light and quick, and Emily turned just in time to see Lily standing there, her small frame wrapped in the oversized sleeves of the shirt she had been given, her eyes still heavy with sleep but curious, taking in the unfamiliar space with a quiet kind of wonder. "Mommy," she said softly, and Emily was on her feet before she even realized she had moved, crossing the distance quickly and kneeling down to her level, brushing her hair back gently. "I am right here," she murmured, and Lily looked past her for a brief second, her gaze landing on Sebastian, not afraid, not uncertain, just observant in the way children often were when they sensed something different but not necessarily dangerous, and she tilted her head slightly. "Is this his house?" she asked in a whisper that carried more clearly than intended, and Emily hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder for just a second before answering, "Yes," and Lily nodded slowly, as if processing that information in a way that made sense to her, and then she looked back at her mother, her small voice steady in a way that made Emily's chest tighten. "Then maybe we can stay for a little while," she said, simple and honest. And Emily felt the weight of that sentence settle deep inside her, because sometimes the hardest decisions were made in the quietest moments, and across the room, Sebastian watched them both in silence, as if he already knew that everything was about to change again. Lily's words lingered in the air long after she said them, simple and quiet, yet heavier than anything Emily had heard that morning, and Emily felt her breath catch for just a second as she looked at her daughter, searching her face for hesitation, for fear, for anything that would make the decision easier, but Lily only looked back with calm curiosity, as if this place was not overwhelming but safe, as if children could sense something adults often missed, and Emily slowly stood again, her hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder as she turned back toward Sebastian, the weight of his presence still steady, still unmoving, like he had already accepted whatever choice would come next. "Just for a little while," Emily said finally, her voice quiet but clear, and the moment the words left her, something shifted in the room, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough for her to feel it. Like a door had opened somewhere she could not see, and Sebastian nodded once, not in victory, not in approval, just in acknowledgement, as if this had always been the direction things would go. "Then we make sure that little while is not a mistake," he replied, his tone even, and Emily frowned slightly at that, the phrasing catching her attention. "And how do you do that?" she asked, her guard still present even as she stood in his space, and for a brief moment, something sharper flickered behind his calm, not threatening, but purposeful. "By removing what makes your life unstable," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Emily's thoughts pause. Because instability had been the constant in her life for so long she had stopped questioning it, stopped imagining it could be taken away. She glanced down at Lily, who had already begun exploring the edge of the room with quiet steps, her small hand trailing along the surface of the table as if testing the reality of it, and Emily felt that protective instinct rise again, stronger this time, not just about keeping her safe from harm, but from change itself, from stepping too far into something they could not undo. "I do not want her to get used to something that can disappear," Emily said softly, almost more to herself than to him, but Sebastian heard it. Of course he did, and he took a step closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough to make his presence felt in a different way, more direct, more grounded. "Then do not treat it like it will disappear," he answered, and Emily looked up at him, caught off guard by the certainty in his voice, because he did not speak like someone offering temporary help. He spoke like someone establishing something permanent, and that realization unsettled her again, because permanence meant responsibility, meant consequences she could not predict. Footsteps approached once more, and Maria appeared at the doorway, her expression composed but attentive. "Everything is prepared," she said quietly, her gaze moving briefly to Emily and Lily before returning to Sebastian, and he nodded once, the silent exchange carrying meaning Emily could not fully grasp. And then he looked back at her. "You will have what you need here," he said, and there was no hesitation in his words, no uncertainty, just a statement delivered with the same calm authority he had carried since the moment she first saw him. Emily nodded slowly, not because she fully trusted it, but because she understood something was already in motion, something beyond her control, and as she reached for Lily's hand, guiding her gently back toward the room she had woken up in, she felt that shift again, deeper now, more real, because staying, even for a little while, had already started to change the shape of everything, and behind her, Sebastian Hale remained where he stood, watching in silence, as if he already knew that, a little while, was never going to be as simple as it sounded. The rest of the morning unfolded in a way that felt almost unreal, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did, and that alone was enough to keep Emily on edge as she watched Lily settle into the unfamiliar space with a kind of quiet adaptability that children seem to possess without effort, moving from the bed to the window, then to the small table where a glass of juice had appeared as if placed there without sound, and Emily could not stop noticing how everything here functioned before a need was even spoken, how every detail seemed anticipated, controlled, arranged in a way that left no room for chaos. She stood near the doorway for a long moment, arms loosely crossed, observing rather than participating, her instinct still telling her to stay ready, to stay alert, because places like this did not exist without a structure she did not understand, and she had learned not to trust what she could not read. A soft knock came again, and Maria stepped in with the same calm presence as before, carrying a small stack of folded clothes for Lily, brighter this time, softer, more like something a child would choose, and Lily's face lit up immediately, the kind of simple joy that made Emily's chest tighten, because it reminded her how little it had taken to make her daughter happy, how much she had been missing without ever asking for it. "For you," Maria said gently, handing the clothes to Lily, who accepted them with both hands, her small voice quick with excitement. "Thank you," and then she turned to Emily, her eyes searching for permission, and Emily nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a faint line as she watched Lily change right there, unbothered, unguarded, as if this place had already begun to feel normal to her. "She adapts quickly," Maria observed quietly, and Emily let out a soft breath, her gaze still fixed on her daughter. "She has had to," she replied, and there was something in her tone that carried more than just the words, something that spoke of nights like the one before, of years spent adjusting instead of settling, and Maria nodded once, as if she understood more than she let on. "That can be a strength," she said, "or a burden," and Emily glanced at her briefly, surprised by the honesty, but before she could respond, Maria stepped back, giving her space again, leaving the thought lingering behind. Later, as Emily walked slowly through the hallway with Lily at her side, she noticed small things she had not seen before, doors slightly open revealing rooms that looked untouched, perfectly arranged, a staircase that curved upward into shadows she could not see the end of, and always, somewhere in the background, movement that never felt rushed, never chaotic, just present enough to remind her that this place was alive in ways she could not fully observe. When they returned to the main room, Sebastian was there again, standing near the window, his posture unchanged, his attention shifting toward them the moment they entered, and Lily slowed slightly, her small hand tightening around Emily's, not out of fear, but out of awareness, as if she recognized him as something important even if she did not understand why, and Emily felt that shift again, that quiet pull between caution and something else she could not name. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his voice directed at Emily but his gaze briefly acknowledging Lily, and Emily nodded once. "Enough," she answered, and there was a pause, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, as if every word here carried more weight than it should have, and then he glanced toward Lily again. "Do you like the room?" he asked, and Lily looked up at him, considering the question with a seriousness that made Emily's lips almost curve. "It is quiet," she said, and he nodded slightly, as if that answer meant more than it sounded, and Emily watched the exchange carefully, something shifting in her perception, because this was not what she expected from a man like him, not the attention to small details, not the patience in his tone, and that made her more uncertain, not less. She stepped forward slightly, drawing his attention back to her, and this time her voice carried a different kind of steadiness, not defensive, but searching. "You said you remove. What makes life unstable," she said. "What does that actually mean?" And Sebastian held her gaze, silent for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal, and then he answered in the same calm, controlled voice, "It means the things that forced you to struggle do not get the chance to do it again." And Emily felt the weight of those words settle slowly, because they sounded simple, but they hinted at something far more powerful than anything she had allowed herself to expect, and as she stood there, holding Lily's hand, she realized that whatever this man offered, it was not just help, it was a shift in the rules entirely, and that realization stayed with her long after the words had faded. Emily did not respond immediately, because his words did not feel like a promise, they felt like a shift in gravity, something that could pull her life in a direction she had never prepared for, and she found herself tightening her grip on Lily's hand just slightly, grounding herself in something real before she spoke again. "People have tried to help before," she said carefully, her voice steady but guarded. "It never lasted." And Sebastian listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle stillness in the way he held himself, as if every word she said was being measured, not judged, just understood in a way that made her uneasy. "Then they were not in a position to make it last," he replied simply, and Emily let out a faint breath at that, something between disbelief and frustration, because he spoke about things like permanence as if it was something a person could decide, as if life did not interfere, as if circumstances did not shift without warning, and she shook her head slightly. "You make it sound easy," she said, and for the first time, his gaze sharpened just a fraction, not in anger, but in clarity. "No," he answered, "I make it sound controlled," and the distinction settled into her thoughts more deeply than she expected, because control was something she had never truly had, not over money, not over time, not even over where she would sleep from one month to the next, and hearing it spoken like that made her realize how much of her life had been shaped by reacting instead of deciding. Lily shifted beside her, her attention drifting between them, absorbing more than either of them intended, and Emily gently guided her toward a chair nearby, brushing her hair back once more, a small habit she could not seem to stop, before turning back to Sebastian, her expression more focused now, less uncertain. "And what do you expect from me in return?" she asked, because that question had been waiting beneath everything else, unspoken but constant, and the room seemed to quiet even further as the words settled between them. Sebastian did not answer right away, and that pause stretched just long enough to make Emily's instincts rise again, her mind preparing for something she might not want to hear, but when he finally spoke, his voice remained calm, deliberate. "Nothing you are not already capable of giving," he said, and Emily frowned slightly at that, the answer not matching the weight of the question. "That is not an answer," she replied, more directly this time, and he nodded once, acknowledging that, before stepping closer, just enough for his presence to feel more defined without becoming overwhelming. "You take care of your daughter," he continued, his gaze steady on hers. "You keep doing that," and Emily blinked once, caught off guard by the simplicity again, because it felt too small, too obvious for something that had already changed so much, and yet, something in his tone told her there was more beneath it, something he was not saying out loud. "That is it?" she asked quietly. And he held her gaze for a moment longer before answering, "For now," and those two words carried more weight than anything else he had said, because they opened a space of uncertainty she could not ignore, not a threat, not a condition, but a reminder that this situation was still unfolding, still shifting into something neither of them had fully defined. Emily nodded slowly, absorbing that, not fully trusting it, but no longer rejecting it either, and as she glanced toward Lily, who was now quietly sipping juice at the table, her small legs swinging slightly above the floor, she felt something shift again, not just fear, not just caution, but a fragile sense of possibility she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time, and that possibility was enough to keep her there, at least for now, even as she understood that stepping into a life controlled by someone like Sebastian Hale meant she was entering a world where nothing would ever be as simple as it seemed. The conversation should have ended there, but it did not, because something about the way he said, "For now," stayed with Emily long after the words were spoken, echoing quietly in the back of her mind as the hours moved forward with a strange, unfamiliar steadiness, and she found herself adjusting to the rhythm of the house without meaning to, noticing how meals appeared without being asked for, How Lily was guided gently by Maria into small routines that felt almost natural, how every corner of this place seemed to anticipate need before it became a problem, and that level of control both eased and unsettled her at the same time. She stood by the window later that afternoon, watching the light shift across the grounds outside, the world beyond the gates distant and quiet, and she realized she had not thought about her old apartment once since that morning, not the narrow hallway, not the peeling paint, not the constant tension of wondering how long they could stay before something went wrong, and that absence of worry felt unfamiliar, like a silence she did not yet trust. Footsteps approached behind her, measured and unhurried, and she did not need to turn to know it was him, because his presence had a way of settling into a space without effort, and when she finally looked over her shoulder, Sebastian was already there, his attention focused not on the view, but on her, as if observing how she fit into this new environment. "You are thinking about leaving," he said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what he saw, and Emily exhaled softly, a faint, almost tired smile touching her lips. "I am thinking about what happens if I stay," she corrected, and his gaze held hers for a moment, something unreadable passing through it before he nodded slightly, as if that answer carried more weight than the one he expected. "And?" he prompted, and Emily hesitated, not because she did not have an answer, but because she was not sure how to say it without sounding like she was already stepping into something she had not agreed to. "It feels too stable," she admitted finally, her voice quieter now, like it could disappear just as easily, and there was a vulnerability in that statement she did not often allow herself to show, because stability had never been something she could rely on, only something she borrowed for as long as it lasted. Sebastian listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way he stood, more grounded, more certain, as if this was the part of the conversation that mattered most. "It does not disappear," he said calmly, and Emily looked at him again, searching his face for any sign of exaggeration, any hint that this was just another version of reassurance she had heard before, but there was none, only that same steady certainty that had followed him from the beginning, and it made her uneasy in a different way, because certainty like that did not come from hope, it came from control. "Everything disappears," she replied softly, almost reflexively, and for the first time, he did not respond right away, the silence stretching between them, not empty, but deliberate, as if he was considering something beyond the immediate conversation, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a slightly different weight, quieter but more defined. "Only the things you cannot protect," he said, and the words settled deeper than she expected, because they reframed everything she had believed about her life, not as something that had been taken from her, but as something she had never had the power to hold on to in the first place. Emily turned back toward the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, and for a moment she saw herself the way she had been just days ago, tired, uncertain, constantly adjusting, and then she saw the version of herself standing here now, still uncertain, still cautious, but no longer reacting to every shift around her, and that difference, however small, felt significant. Behind her, Sebastian remained still, giving her space without stepping away, and she realized that was part of it too, the way he did not rush her, did not push her into decisions she was not ready to make, but also did not step back far enough to let her forget that this world was already shaping itself around her, and as she stood there, caught between what she had been and what she might become, Emily understood something she had not been ready to admit before, that staying was no longer just about survival, it was about choosing a future she did not yet understand, and that choice, once made, would change everything in ways she could not take back. That night, the house felt different, not because anything had changed, but because Emily had, and as she stood in the quiet hallway outside Lily's room, listening to the soft, steady rhythm of her daughter's breathing, she realized that for the first time in years, she was not calculating the next step, not planning how to stretch what little they had just a bit further, not bracing for something to go wrong. And that absence of pressure felt unfamiliar in a way that made her uneasy rather than comforted. She leaned lightly against the doorframe, her arms folded as her thoughts circled back to everything Sebastian had said, the certainty in his voice, the way he spoke about control like it was not just possible but expected, and she found herself questioning it again, not because she wanted to reject it, but because she did not know how to believe in something she had never experienced. Footsteps echoed softly from the far end of the hallway, measured and unhurried, and Emily straightened instinctively, her senses sharpening even before she turned, and when she did, he was already there, the low light catching the sharp lines of his expression, his presence as composed as ever, as if the entire house moved in rhythm with him rather than around him. "She is asleep?" he asked quietly, his voice lowered without losing its steadiness, and Emily nodded once. "She always sleeps deeper when she feels safe," she replied, the words slipping out before she could filter them. And something in his gaze shifted at that, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel it, like he had registered the meaning behind what she said rather than the words themselves. He stepped closer, stopping at a distance that felt intentional, neither distant nor intrusive, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence settling between them in a way that was no longer uncomfortable. "Just present, just real, you are still deciding," he said after a moment, and Emily let out a slow breath, a faint smile touching her lips, not from humor, but from recognition. "I think I already did," she answered, her voice quieter now, more certain than it had been earlier, and his gaze held hers, searching for something unspoken. "Staying for a little while is still a decision," he replied, and Emily nodded slightly. "It is," she agreed, "but it is not just about staying anymore," and the admission hung there, heavier than anything she had said before, because it acknowledged something she had been avoiding, something she had only just begun to understand. Sebastian did not interrupt, did not push, he simply waited, and that patience gave her the space to continue, to say what she had not planned to say out loud. "If I stay," she went on slowly, "it changes things for her," her eyes drifting briefly toward the closed door behind her. "She will start to expect this stability," and there was a quiet vulnerability in her voice that she did not try to hide this time, because this was not about her anymore. It was about what her daughter would come to believe was normal. He followed her gaze for a brief second before looking back at her, and when he spoke, his tone was just as steady as before, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something more deliberate. "Then let it be normal," he said, and Emily looked at him again, the simplicity of the statement catching her off guard once more, because it was not a reassurance, it was a decision presented as fact, and that difference mattered more than she wanted to admit. "You keep saying things like that," she said softly, "like everything here is already decided," and for the first time, there was a pause in his response, not hesitation, but consideration, as if he was choosing his words more carefully than before, and when he answered, his voice carried that same calm certainty, but with a clarity that made it feel more real, more grounded. "Because once I decide something," he said, "I do not leave it unfinished," and the weight of those words settled into the space between them, not threatening, not overwhelming, but undeniable. Because it explained everything she had felt since stepping into this house, the control, the stability, the sense that nothing here existed by accident. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for doubt, for uncertainty, for anything that would make this easier to question, but she found none, and slowly, almost without realizing it, she nodded, not in agreement, not fully, but in understanding, because for the first time, she saw the shape of what he was offering, not just temporary safety, but something far more permanent, something that would change the course of her life and her daughter's life in ways she could not yet fully see. And as she stood there in the quiet hallway, with the door behind her and him in front of her, Emily realized that whatever came next, she was no longer standing on the edge of that decision, she was already inside it. The next morning did not feel like a continuation, it felt like a quiet beginning, and Emily noticed it the moment she opened her eyes, not because anything around her had changed, but because something inside her had settled into a decision she could no longer pretend she had not made. And as she turned her head to see Lily still asleep beside her, her small hand curled loosely against the pillow, Emily felt that same protective instinct rise again, but this time it carried something new. Something steadier, less desperate, like it was no longer about holding things together but about building something that might actually last. She moved quietly, careful not to wake her, and stepped into the hallway where the morning light stretched across the floor in long, calm lines, the house already awake in its quiet, controlled way. And as she walked, she realized she was no longer hesitating with each step, no longer measuring whether she belonged here, because somewhere between last night and now, that question had shifted into something else entirely. When she reached the main room, Sebastian was already there, exactly where she expected him to be, as if his presence followed a pattern she had only just begun to understand, and he looked up the moment she entered, his gaze steady, aware, as if he had been waiting without actually waiting. "You did not leave," he said, not as a question, not even as an observation, just a simple acknowledgement of something already known. And Emily let out a soft breath, her lips pressing together for a moment before she answered, "No," and there was no hesitation in her voice this time, no uncertainty hiding beneath it, just a quiet certainty that surprised even her. He studied her for a brief second. Not searching for doubt, but confirming what had already changed, and then he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that carried more meaning than any longer response could have, and Emily stepped closer, stopping at a distance that felt natural now, not forced, not cautious, just balanced. "I am not staying because I have no other option," she said, her voice calm but deliberate, because that mattered, because she needed it to be understood, and his gaze held hers without interruption, giving her space to say what she needed to say. "I am staying because I choose to," she finished, and the words settled between them with a quiet finality that made everything else fall into place around them. For a moment, nothing else was said, the silence stretching in a way that felt complete rather than empty, and then Sebastian moved slightly, not closing the distance, but shifting the space between them into something more defined. "Then we move forward," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just the same controlled certainty that had shaped everything from the moment she met him, but this time, it did not feel distant, it felt aligned with the decision she had just made. Footsteps echoed softly from behind, and Emily turned to see Lily standing there again, her hair still slightly messy from sleep, her eyes brighter now, more awake, and without thinking, Emily reached for her, guiding her gently forward, and Lily looked up at Sebastian with that same quiet curiosity she had shown before, not intimidated, not unsure, just observing, and after a second, she offered a small smile, simple and unguarded, the kind that did not calculate risk or consequence. Sebastian's gaze shifted to her briefly, and something in his expression softened just enough to be noticed, not dramatically, not in a way that changed who he was, but in a way that made the space around them feel different, less distant, more grounded, and then his attention returned to Emily, the moment settling into something unspoken but understood. Emily glanced between them, her hand still resting lightly on Lily's shoulder, and she realized that this was not just about her anymore, not just about survival or even stability. It was about stepping into something that would shape both of their lives in ways she could not fully see yet, and for the first time, that uncertainty did not feel like something to fear, it felt like something to face. Outside, beyond the windows, the world continued as it always had, unpredictable, shifting, uncertain, but inside, something had changed, something quiet but permanent, and as Emily stood there, no longer at the edge of a decision but fully inside it, she understood a truth she had spent years avoiding. That survival kept you alive, but choosing where to stand, that was what decided who you became.